So we are going to continue with the theme of social institutions, but this time we are dealing with the institutions of kinship, marriage and family. And the focus largely will be on India. However, before I begin my focus on India, I will be going into some of the conceptual aspects of each of these institutions. And in order to do that, I am going to introduce some comparative examples, which are not from India and which may also relate to primitive societies, specifically in the context of kinship. Now, as you all know, these three institutions are actually, fundamental to our lives, to our identities. They are where we get what you would call our primary identities. And I just want to, at this point, say that they're also fundamentally linked to the concept of gender. Now, unfortunately, since we only have a 4-hour class and I can only cover that much, gender is something that we will do in our next class, which will be, I think, after in the next week. But you will see that many of the things that we discussed today with regard to identity within the family, with regard to the cultural codes in the family and so on, have resonance for the issue of gender. So, I have actually tried to introduce some videos, and I have just very short, 3-minute, 10-minute videos, just to sort of space the 4 hours and try to make it as interesting for you as possible. To a certain extent, many of these things are, are not, you're not familiar with it. So I will introduce, sort of some symbols and genealogical charts and what to do, how to do a genealogical chart. And I think many of you who may go into research later on will find this quite useful if you take it up. So, so the lecture is going to broadly be structured in this way. Firstly, we look at what the relevance is for these institutions. Why are we studying them? Why is it important for such a diverse group of students who are majoring in completely different subjects? Why is it important to look at family, marriage, kinship? Why do we think that this is foundational? Then I'm going to outline for each of these. I'm going to outline the conceptual terrain. So, and I will do it separately. So first we will deal with kinship, then marriage, and then family. And I want to say that I had some trouble actually trying to think about, what should one do first? Because, does kinship come before marriage? Does marriage come before family? So there is a bit of that tension here. What is it that we discuss first? And I have tried as far as possible to try and structurally link each of these institutions in the discussion that follows. And we then look at the dynamics of these institutions in India, and the way in which I try to do this is through examples to give you an overview of what's going on. And I think towards the end of the lecture, what I'm going to do is sort of try and talk about, sort of new directions in these institutions. Okay, so the central argument, I think, ties in with what we were doing last week, which is that how is a person's sense of identity, sense of being and belonging drawn from his or her engagement with these institutions of kinship, family and marriage, and that these institutions are embedded in larger structures. So they're embedded in each other, they are embedded in other larger structures. So for instance, if you think of family, from a gender perspective, we know that the family is embedded in patriarchal structures, embedded in patriarchy. So, so partly we are going to deal with how this, in what ways this embeddedness is manifest, and also the embeddedness in terms of its relationship to other institutions, which is what we were trying to do in the last class as well. Okay, so before I go any further, I think in the last class there were some complaints about some people not being able to hear adequately because of a murmur. So some people are talking, so there's a sort of hum all the time, which I don't hear because I'm just hearing my own voice. So I request that please don't do that. If you are bored, just sit quietly. Don't, please enable the other people who are wanting to listen to actually be able to listen. Okay. So the third thing that we try to do through this is, and I think which is the most sort of interesting when you're doing sociology, is that we challenge common sense understanding of these institutions. So if you think of what we tried to do in the last class is when we thought about school, the common sense understanding of the school is as an agent of socialization, is as a place where you get education, where you learn your values, and we looked at that as an institution where only certain kinds of values were being perpetuated. We looked at it as an institution which was perpetuating inequalities and so on. So we will try to do some of that as well, so that we challenge the common sense assumptions of the institution. The other thing that we challenge is the private nature of these institutions. So if you look at family, marriage, and kinship, all of these institutions are within the realm of the private world of individuals. And in a sense, when we study them sociologically, what we are also trying to do is trying to see in what ways there is a relationship of this private world to the larger public domain, right? So, and you do this again through the argument of embeddedness. When I said earlier that the family is embedded in patriarchal structures. Kinship, if you look at primitive kinship, it's embedded, economic relations are embedded in kinship. So there are ways in which there is the private and the public no longer remain clearly demarcated and separate domains. Okay, so why is this relevant? Fundamentally, what we are doing through each of these institutions is looking at relatedness. And now this I want to say that this whole concept of relatedness is something that has only come up in later studies in kinship, because earlier we were looking at the biological and social bases of kinship. And now increasingly there is, again with the new kinds of families and the new ways of relatedness that have been fashioned in modern context, we find that increasingly there is a focus on the question of what are the different forms of relatedness, so that it's no longer just simply a question of which is the family and what is going on in the family and a certain definition of the family, but that definition of the family also has undergone certain changes. So if you think of this whole idea of friends are the new family, right? If you think of the idea of chosen families, so the fact of gay and lesbian families, that all of these have to a certain extent changed our traditional notions of what the family is, and therefore forcing us to look at the different ways in which people consider themselves to be related to each other. Now, kinship is often considered to be the sort of primary unit through which social organization and social relationships are built. So, in that sense, it's considered to be the building block of society. And the social roles and relationships are mapped through these relationships. So whether you think of, one is how you learn your social roles, you learn primarily through these institutions, and your primary social roles, that of a daughter, a wife, a husband, a father, all of these are marked in these institutions. Now what you do in relatedness, in understanding relatedness, is that you are sharing substance. So you're sharing bodily substance and transmitting bodily substance. So the biological fact of kinship is located in the way in which bodily substances are shared and transmitted. And by bodily substance, we mean blood, milk, and other genetic substances. So sperm would be a bodily substance as well. The second aspect is the experience of spiritual connections. And I think if you look at the example of Friends Are the New Family, there is other kind of connectedness that we are talking about here. So the whole issue of the soul, rebirth, nurturance and care, all of these realms fall within that other kind of connectedness. So one, you have the sharing of biological substance and the experience of spiritual connectedness. And the notion of relatedness is actually to be explored through both these realms. Now, kinship, family, and marriage, all these institutions structure and influence different aspects of our lives. First, one thing that they fundamentally do is that they structure and influence the inheritance of property. So through these institutions, it is decided who is it, how and who will inherit what kind of property. It is also these are also institutions that decides on succession to political office. So any kind of, so if you look at primitive kinship, chieftainship, and other political offices and how they are carried on through a particular lineage. That is something that is structured through kinship. It's also your access to and relationship with the supernatural. So if you think of the religious institutions and the functions that religious institutions carry out, kinship and family are mediators through which these functions may be carried out. So your relationship to God, your relationship to your ancestors, all of these and the ritual dimensions of these relationships are actually embedded in kinship relations. Then you, of course, where you live, so your residence, who you marry, who you cooperate with, who you will help, and who will help you when in times of trouble. All of these issues are configured through these institutions of kinship, marriage, and family. So if you think of this as something that is, so I think this enables us to think of kinship, marriage, and family as not something that is confined just to the intimate, private domain, but is something that goes beyond it. So for instance, you're in a new city, you're going to look for a job. Often it is your kinship ties that you sort of call on in order to find out, who knows whom and, where there may be vacancies and so on. Now, as I said before, the study of these institutions are critical for these two reasons. One is that they uncover the relationship between the biological and the social. So if you think of the shared biological substance and the connections that we experience between people and that kind of relationship, these institutions actually highlight that relationship between the biological and the social, and they relate to the private and the public domains. So how do things that is inherently at the realm of the intimate and the private domain, how are they connected to a larger public world? So I think that in brief, this is how we can assess or understand why these institutions are relevant for us, and why then do we all have to study these institutions. Okay. So what is kinship? It is the recognition of, you don't need to write because I'm going to put this PowerPoint up on Moodle, and which is why it's also quite detailed. As you will see, I've written everything out because then it enables you to use it as reading material as well. So it's the recognition of that relationship between persons, and it's based on descent and marriage. So there are basically two theoretical positions, and we will be discussing both these theoretical positions vis-a-vis kinship. One is descent and alliance. So marriage, when we talk of marriage, it's alliance. Now those related through descent are blood relatives or consanguines, and those related through marriage are affinal relatives, are affines. So a father's brother's son is a consanguine, and the wife's brother would be an affine. So you have, in a kinship system then, you think there are relatives which are consanguineous relatives, and there are relatives who are affinal relatives. Now in most small-scale societies, you would find that kinship is actually the basic organizing principle, in the sense that it is through kinship that other social institutions are ordered. Of course, in modern societies, kinship gets, it gets more complex, but even so, we continue to see the influence of kinship in many aspects of our lives. So these are, whenever you, and I think it's a good attempt to try and construct your own genealogical chart by using these symbols, and that's why I've put it up there. So you have the male, the female with the circle, the male with the triangle, the marital relationship, and the parent-child relationship. The sibling relationship, which is up there, and then deceased individuals. So if you were to do your, you can use this to actually do this exercise of constructing your own genealogical chart. Huh? Is there a logic? I actually don't know if there is a logic. I mean, I think very simply, I think the phallic symbol is what is for the male, and so that logic is there. But other than that, I don't know. Huh? The deceased is cross, and then there's also, I think, there's also a symbol for the divorced, which is I don't know whether it's blackened or something like that. It's colored. So this is the example you see of a married couple with 5 children. So this suggests the line across suggests the sibling relationship, and the line which connects the married couple to the children. I will come to that. So there is descent will be of different kinds. So there can be patrilineal descent or matrilineal descent, right? No, but essentially, when you think of kinship is essentially bilateral. So it means that your identity fundamentally is derived from both your mother's side as well as your. So, you know, if you think of kinship in terms of biological substance, it is bilateral. Also socially, it is bilateral. But in terms of if you think of the transmission of inheritance, of political office, and all those factors, their descent is to be either through the male line or through the female line. There are examples of double descent as well, but we are not going to get into that. It's far too complicated for you to get into. So, okay, so then these are the symbols for, marriage, siblingship, daughter and son. Now I come to descent. So what is descent? It is the principle through which people conceive of themselves in relation to superior generations. So how do I think of myself as being related to generations before me, right? So that's what is the principle. And there are 3, like I said, 3 forms of transmission. One is of property, of an office, of succession, and the right to belong to a kin group. So for instance, if my father has a business and he is the CEO of a company and he is the sole owner, then my father's eldest born son will succeed in that office, right? So there are these 3 forms of transmission. Now descent is unilineal and bilateral. Unilineal descent is of 2 kinds: patrilineal and matrilineal. Patrilineal obviously is through the male line, and matrilineal through the female line, and I'll give you examples of both these kinds. And then we have bilateral descent. Now patrilineal descent runs through the male line and through males only, and in matrilineal it runs through the female line and through females only. All kinship is bilateral, so whatever the principle, individual has ties to both parents. So whether you have matrilineal or patrilineal descent, the ties are through both parents. So at this row here, there are too many people asleep. Like maybe 4 of you are all asleep in one row. You want to just get up and go out for a second and then come back in and sit? Or you're up? You're up? Okay. Okay. So now in another sense, the bilateral system is non-unilineal, implying that the kinship ties are traced through both parents and they may have equal social weight. So when you think of the matrilineal and patrilineal, you see that only one line has greater social weight in relation to the other. So in patrilineal, it's the male line which has more social weight than the female line, and the other way around in the matrilineal. But in the bilateral, both will have equal social weight, and so basically you have a group of relatives who are linked together by a single individual who can trace both descent and or marriage relationships to every other member of the kindred. So this means that as an individual, when your relationship to your father's brother as well as to your mother's brother has equal social weight, right? That becomes a kind of a scenario of bilateral descent. Now, when we have, so you're in a patrilineal system, the male ego is unlikely to inherit from the mother's brother. Am I right? Yeah. Huh? The ego. I mean, ego as in the ego is, I'm saying, the central person. So the man is the child, the male child will inherit in a patrilineal system from the father, not from the mother's brother. So in a bilateral system, you see how if the transmission, in the transmission of those three aspects, if there is equal weightage given to both sides, so then that becomes a system of bilateral descent. Okay, now I'm going to give you 3 examples in patrilineal descent. I've actually chosen, and there is only one example in matrilineal, I've chosen to give you 3 examples from patrilineal because it's also the sort of most dominant form of kinship. And it also connects very well with what we are going to do through family and marriage, and then in our next class on gender. So the first example is that of the Nuer of, okay, now before I get into that, this is the, you see the diagram that is for a patrilineal descent system. You see that, so all the, if you see the green ones, right, all the people are traced to that, I think that's the great-grandfather, the grandfather, the father. So you see that the great-grandfather's daughter is actually, you are related to the daughter of the great-grandfather, but not to anybody else. So this is in a patrilineal system. Okay, so the first example I will give is of the patrilineal system is of the Nuer and of Sudan. And Evans Pritchard, the anthropologist, wrote extensively about the Nuer and about the social and political life of the Nuer, and of course, devoted a great deal of time and energy to describe the kinship system of the Nuer. I'm just going to highlight certain aspects of this kinship system, which I think are very interesting in terms of this whole idea of continuing the patrilineal. Now, the Nuer are largely pastoral, and it's interesting because they're, okay, at the back, 3rd row, from the back in the middle, next to you. Yellow, next to yellow t-shirt, somebody's fast asleep with, yeah, up please, you, yeah. Are you awake? Yeah? Are you awake? Okay, good. No, because there's interesting stuff on ghost marriages coming up, so I thought I should wake you up. Okay, so the Nuer are largely pastoral, which means cattle holds special significance in their lives. But they're also, it's interesting because of the way their environment is structured, they move closer when it's during the rains and apart when it's not raining. So it's it works both ways. Now, among the Nuer, the males and the females lead contrasting lives. So, in a patrilineal system, as you know, partly there is this. It's premised on this kind of sexual division of labor, right? So, so to a certain extent, it's very obvious that men and women lead very contrasting lives. It begins with the kind of initiation that men and women have, and for men, actually, the initiation is. They're initiated into adulthood around the age of 14 and 16 through a very painful ritual which involves the engraving of 6 lines on the forehead, and this is called the gar. For the women, there is no such initiation rituals, and they actually first encounter any kind of ritual attention at the time of marriage. So their initiation into adulthood is much, it's gradual, it's not through this act of an initiation ritual. Now the rights to cattle, because cattle are so central to the ecology of the Nuer, the rights to cattle are through the male line. But the important thing is that, it is only the women who can milk the cattle. So women and uninitiated men have, or basically the uninitiated boys, have the rights to milk the cattle. Now this then places the women, in a kind of significant position in relation to the men. So, so because rights to cattle pass patrilineally to the sons, brothers in the absence of sons, or even to other patrilineally related males. So at no point does the cattle go to women. So if they have sons, it will go to sons. If not sons, then to the brothers, and if not brothers, to distant patrilineal related kins. Now, despite not owning cattle, women are economically crucial because of this rule of only them being able to milk the cows. So, so the woman firstly has the role, this economic role of milking the cows. The woman also has the role of continuing the patrilineage. Right? So it is her, she has a significant role because of her procreative powers in continuing the patrilineage. And the second role is to link the children to the non-lineage kin. So the woman is responsible for linking the children to the matriline. Right? So it means that, in terms of the social role of the mother has the social role of ensuring that the children are connected to the non-lineage kin, which I think is true of many of our patrilineal systems, that it's the mother who then has to keep in touch and has to ensure that these relations are maintained. Now, what happens is that the ego's relationship, or the person's relationship to kin, is derived then from the mother's relationship as the linking woman. So it's the mother who links, who acts as the link between different people, and it is her relationship with those people that determines the relationship that the children will have to those very people. Now, as an example, we give the example of, so what happens then is that women's role is defined both by pulling men together and pulling them apart. And the example that Evans Pritchard gives in this case is of the practice of polygyny. So the fact that men have more than one, are allowed to marry more than one wife. Now within that, if you have two wives, if a man has two wives, then the children from both the wives are part of the patrilineage. So the women are responsible for ensuring the cohesion of this patrilineage, which is the children from both the wives. But at the same time, the women pull the men apart. So the children from wife A and the children from wife B are actually pulled apart because they have an allegiance to the linking woman, which is that they have a separate allegiance to the mother. So in this sense, you see that women actually constantly perform the role of both of pulling men together as well as pulling them apart. So, and this process, which we describe in the context of polygyny, is actually there in many aspects of newer life and kinship, and it's called the process of fission and fusion, right? And the idea is that actually there is social order and integration in the society through this process of fission and fusion, so that you may belong to the same family. So if there is a conflict, this whole patrilineage will come together as one family. But in a conflict between the two groups, they will claim allegiances to their respective mothers. So this is what is called the forces of fission and fusion, based on one's connection to the linking woman. Now, the other interesting, I think, aspect of this of descent and patrilineal descent is that we need to be able to distinguish between descent and the biological link, and there are many ways in which you can see that in newer society. So, so to say that basically when you think of descent and descent through the male line, it is not just about the transmission of biological substance. And throughout our discussion on kinship, you will constantly come across this, the fact that kinship is, okay, it is about certain biological facts, but it is about the social expression of those biological facts. And in different contexts, the social expression is culturally variable, it's very different, and so you may find patrilineal among the newer in a particular way, and when you look at the Brahmins, you'll find in a Tamil village, you'll see it occurring in a completely different way. So it's important then to distinguish between descent and the biological link. So the mother and the father are both biological as well as social. Now, for the newer, we conceive of a biological link between the mother and the father because of the shared substance of procreation. There is a biological link between the mother and the father. But descent runs through the males. So this leads, according to Ivan's picture, to bizarre situations. So because, there is a notion of a social link as well as the fact of the biological link between the mother and the father, but when it comes to descent, this link, the biological link between mother and father is not taken into account. It is the biological link between father and child which becomes primary. So, so what happens then is that, for instance, if one situation is if a man dies unmarried, then his brother might arrange a marriage between a woman and the dead man. So, yeah, this is called ghost marriage. So the idea being, now this, you see that at all costs the patriline has to be maintained, right? So if a man dies and he's not married, it means what? Aage nahi badha na, there's no procreation didn't happen, so that line didn't go forward, right? Chirag bujh gayi, there was no chirag. So the thing is, but what happens here is that because they recognize both the biological and the social, so that the father is at the same time a biological link as well as a social link. Yeah. So what happens is that the brother of the man arranges a marriage between the woman and the dead man, and so the social father was dead, but he passed on that social link, even though dead. So in a sense, in this marriage, which is called the ghost marriage, the child that is born of this marriage is the, well, okay. This is what we call, I'm glad you asked that question, because this is what we call ethnocentrism. So and this is what I was trying to explain also in my last class, then when you think of institutions and the way in which they frame our thoughts and our ways of looking at practices, they're so hegemonic and they have such a hegemonizing influence on us that we are unable to actually see otherwise. So the fact is that for us, it is the biological link between the parent and the child which is most significant, and that is what, when you think of kinship commonsensically, that is what defines everything else. So to imagine a society where there is a biological father and a social father, and that the two may be different, is inconceivable. Even though we have adoption in this society, do we have adoption? Is there a biological father and a father otherwise? Right? It's possible. So think of that. So in the newer, this is what is happening. That the dead man, fundamentally, let's say through a ritual, is being married to a woman. Right? Now, even though the woman is being impregnated obviously by somebody else, possibly the brother, right? What happens is that the social father, so the name, it's about carrying on the name. So when the dead man is married ritualistically to the woman, the children from this woman become are responsible for carrying that patriline through, right? So what you're doing is that you're making a distinction between the pater and the genitor. The pater is the social father and the genitor is the biological father. Yes. Yeah, but that's what I'm saying, that fundamentally then it's also that you have to take into account the fact that there is a certain, that agnatic line is going to go. So even though it's being carried through the brother, his agnatic line, in this way the brother is also going to carry on his own agnatic line, right? And the dead man also gets to carry on. So that name, the dead man's name as well as the brother's name, through other unions is carried on, right? Property is, So the property of the dead man will go through the patriline. See, the confusion arises when you are thinking in terms of this kind of separate, modern notion of how it's supposed, dead man alive, What? Why would a girl? Well, there are, this question of why would we do something, there are many things that we do in our society which are absurd. Don't we do that? I mean, there are absurd notions associated with marriage and family which we all agree to, and yet we do those. So, the fact of the force of custom and the fact of the force of that patrilineal system and the value that is attached to continuing the patrilineage enables people to do that. But anyway, I will also come to, I think something later on addresses your question as well.
It's not like the women have a choice.
No, but that's the thing. The women also have a choice.
They can choose to marry.
They do have a choice as well. So, so the other interesting practice is that in some cases, the social father may not even be male. I think there's another, can we just stop the hum? And if you have something to say, do you want to say it aloud? Okay. So, so there's the custom of marriage between two women, and this illustrates this kind of distinction between the biological and the social. Among the newer as well as among another tribe called the Zulu tribe, they have this custom where if an eminent man dies without leaving a son, then the daughter sometimes marries another woman. So if the man has no sons, has a daughter, the daughter marries another woman. Now, this other woman takes on the role of a mother. Not mother to the person she marries, but mother of a child of the person she marries, right? So, I can't hear if all of you are going to talk and joke. So there are, right. So then there are two women who get married, right? And the one who is the dead man's daughter becomes the husband. The dead man's daughter takes on the role of a husband, and the other woman who she marries takes on the role of the wife and can procreate through sexual union with another man. It's crazy, isn't it? Yeah. No, that's not true. Okay, now the other thing that I want to say is that, fundamentally what we are doing here is some of the questions that are, can I have, okay, do you want me to leave? Should I leave? Okay, then I don't want anybody to take on the role of shooing anybody else. Okay, so in this form of marriage, when you ask these questions, what you're essentially doing is you're linking sexuality to marriage, right? So basically, it's like, who will this daughter have sex with? Come on. I mean, why is that even a question? Because you think only in sex, you can have sex only when you're married and not before that or after that. So then they can, right? Yeah. Okay, so this is a custom which, now the customs that I'm highlighting are really customs that are used to extend this principle of the patrilineage, right? Yeah. If you have a valid question that is not, yeah. Why is it a problem? So if let's say two women are married, in this situation, one woman, yeah. But the descent is always through the male line. In a certain relationship, in this relationship where the dead man's daughter gets married, the dead man's daughter is the man, right? So the kids that come from the woman who she is married to will be, the dead man's name will come to them, right? Yeah. So if this woman then again has a child with another man, then it will be that man's lineage which will be carried on, right? So now this, bizarre, these bizarre, what seem like bizarre practices are actually practices that enable the continuation of that patrilineage. Yes? You will have to speak up because there's no, or come here. Ghost marriage is practiced among the newer. So all these practices that I'm talking about are among the newer. And I'm using them again as an example to show how the importance of continuing the patrilineage, so that when you have a situation where the patrilineage is not going to be continued, these are the kinds of practices that are in place.
Doesn't the point of patrilineage become moot?
Point of?
Patrilineage become moot if there is so much flexibility.
But why would you say that? Because in this case, actually the flexibility is to ensure that the patrilineage continues. You are, again, the point of what you're saying, if I'm hearing correctly, what you're saying is, isn't the patrilineage being corrupted? Is that right? And that point of corruption of the patrilineage is a point that you're making from your own assumptions of what the patrilineage is, which is our modern assumptions. Is it not right? So when you think of, most of the questions that you've asked are actually fundamentally tying sexuality to marriage, tying patrilineage to sexuality, linking the biological and the social, and in this case they're just trying to differentiate it. In which case then, the person who cannot have a child, so there is no stigma which is attached to these categories of people. There are ways in which systems are in place by which those categories of people can also, continue with the patrilineage. Blind adultery. So blind adultery, when men cannot have children, women can be adulterous and they can beget the children of other. But the social father, even though the person who cannot have the child it's not his biological child, but this person remains the social father, right? What? Similar kind of example, yeah. Yeah. Okay. No, procreating for what? For next generation. But this next generation, when you have a next generation, what are you passing on to the next generation? That's what the point is. So if the question that is being raised here is it just a question then of procreation? Why are we talking of patrilineal and matrilineal? It's just a question of procreation. But the fact is that through kinship, we are not just, that's what I mentioned right at the beginning, that the rules are not just about transmitting biological substance from one body to the other. The rules, they encompass so much more of our lives. So when you think, why is it, it's not about patrilineal, matrilineal, it's actually fundamentally about systems. And when we talk of patrilineal systems, it is about a complex of practices. So whether it's blind adultery, whether it's ghost marriage, all of these are practices that keep that system intact, right? So if it was just about procreation, then what is the need for a system of rules and regulations to be in place? That's what. So kinship is about the biological as well as about the social. So when we think of procreation, how is life going to be organized post that procreative act? Yeah, but the point, I think the point that we've made even in the last class is that as individuals, and I don't want to get into a debate with this because it's never ending, but as individuals we are embedded in social structures. What we do is determined to a large extent by the rules that we've learned. Yes, we subvert the rules. Yes, we do things that we want to do, and we think that we do things that we want to do. But even the things that we want to do is configured by certain structural aspects. Within the limits of that, we innovate, we subvert, we do all this, but to a large extent, we shape structures and structures shape us. So when you think of myself and sociological phenomena out there, I don't think it works like that. Because what you consider to be sociological phenomena inheres in individual personalities. Okay. Yeah, totally. Yeah, I agree that as individuals we change how we behave changes the structure. So if you think of families and the way in which families, towards the end of the lecture we can discuss this a little bit about how families have changed, how relationship and social roles within families have changed. So, women's roles, post the sort of moving out of the domestic front to work in the public realm, post that, how have women's roles in the household changed? Have they changed at all? In certain households, yes, there have been certain changes. If you look at the feminist movement and its impact on women's roles, there have been changes, right? So, of course, the way in which individuals behave and act within institutions over a period of time lead to certain other kinds of typifications that then lead to change within those institutions. Okay, now I'm going to very briefly compare this with Brahmin kinship in a Tamil village, and you will see how the two are different. Now, this is a study by Kathleen Goff, and it's Brahmins of a Tanjore village, which was studied by Kathleen Goff, and they're patrilineal, patrilocal, extended family. They have joint ownership of land. Okay, there in that row, can you wake him up? Next to you, yeah, wake him up. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah. 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 Right. Or a goat in certain cases. Yeah, you do. That happens too. So now in this in this Brahmin with Brahmin kinship in this Tamil village, you see that There's joint ownership of land. Even though there will be some women some men who have moved out to urban areas for work. So there are some incomplete extended families. So largely, you look at the family and the household unit in the sense that they do own land, they do derive something from land, and so it functions then both as an economic as well as a social unit. In Brahmin kinship in this Tamil village, we find that final authority rests with the male head of the household. Now, the relationship between the father and the son is asymmetrical. So, relationships within the family are largely hierarchical, asymmetrical relationships. Same again among the brothers. There is a difference of rank according to age, authority of the older over the younger, and there is an ideal of personal devotion which characterizes the relationships between people. Women in this context are revered as mothers. So their significance, their importance, their respect comes from their role of being mothers. And interestingly, they're devalued as marital partners. So, Catherine Gough actually points out that the position of women in this kinship system is quite paradoxical because on the one hand, the mother is valued because she has the procreative power, which no man has, and at the same time, the sexuality, which is at the root of this procreative power, is devalued. So if you think of, all the sort of rules and norms and regulations around control of sexuality, the fact that menstruation is considered to be defiling, childbirth, if you think of, in many families, childbirth is something that is polluting. So the first 13 days or 14 days, you're actually segregated. So there are all these practices. And all of these practices are in order to keep the pollutant away from the pure, right? So, the whole sort of principle of purity and pollution is at work with regard to with regard to the kinship system. So, interestingly, the dilemma over here is that even though the system is perpetuated and the perpetuation is traced through men, it is achieved through women, right? So, because it's women who have the procreative power. Now, Brahmins attempt to solve this dilemma by assimilating the wife to the husband. So this fact of, the better half, the idea that the woman, that the man is nothing without his wife, all of this then signifies how the woman has to becomes a part of the man, is somebody who embodies the procreative powers of the man. Now, in this system, clearly the mother's and the wife's lineage become are of secondary significance. It's the male lineage which is of primary significance. And even here, the mother is, of course, has to keep in touch or has to do what she needs to in order to keep the bilateral nature of kinship alive. But largely, the social weight is on the male line. And this you see in the kind of severance that is there of the woman at the time of marriage from her conjugal unit. So in order for this dilemma to be resolved, the wife's loyalty to the husband's family and to the husband has to be demonstrated, is often demonstrated through a complete severance of relations with the conjugal family. Now, if you think of what is going on here, you will see that both among the newer as well as the Brahmins, the patrilineages are important social units. And there is a certain cultural ideology of that male line which brings this system together, which ensures cohesiveness and solidarity of the system. Now, in the Brahmin system, interestingly, women are seen as dangerous because women are seen as pollutants. Among the newer, you don't have that, right? So now women are seen as dangerous in a couple of different senses. Firstly, they're seen as dangerous they're seen as a threat to patrilineal solidarity. So they are seen as people who cause trouble between men. And we'll see that again in the next example when we discuss Punjabi kinship. And among the newer, there is ambivalence with regard to women's roles, because if you remember, I said that they are the people who keep this process of fission and fusion alive, right? So on the one hand, they bring men together, but they also split men's groups apart. So now, but significantly among the Brahmins, what distinguishes them from the newer case is that this kind of danger of women is also seen in sexual terms. So it is the sexuality of women which is also seen as dangerous. Now both societies, both the newer as well as the Brahmins, value fertility, value human fertility, because the value that is placed in patrilineage is on continuing the male line, right? So human fertility is of crucial significance. So the production of sons is very important. But the two groups differ radically in the way in which they go about this process of the production of sons. Now, among the newer, we saw that there are all these other practices like the ghost marriage, the blind adultery, the woman-to-woman marriage, which are all practices that enable this aspect of having sons, right? So basically, there is a great deal of flexibility which is introduced in the system in order to ensure that the male line can be continued. I'll come to you once I finish the thought, otherwise once it leaves me I'm going to be... Now among the Brahmins again, now the options are very few. So you are then left with the stigma that is associated with the barren woman, the childless couple, and so on. So among the Brahmins, if the couple fails to have children, polygamy is an option. But that's the only option. So the only option is that you have to grow your own, right? So there's nothing else that you can do. Whereas among the newer, there are a lot more different kinds of choices that is available. So this contrast is linked to female sexuality. Among newer, the women have greater control, they have more autonomy with regard to the sexuality. Virginity is not something that is expected at marriage. It is not something that is even asked of. Extramarital affairs, even though they may anger the husband, but they're not considered to be morally wrong. So you see, among the newer, sexuality and fertility are not linked, right? So, and sexuality and morality within the family and within the kinship system are delinked. But
Tribal societies are generally more liberal anyway, right? Like when you talk about that's completely different.
yeah, that's true. So that, many of these, again, I have taken up the example of the Brahmin kinship. If you look at sort of Brahmin kinship and compare it, and we can do that in our gender class a little bit. If you compare it with the systems of kinship among the lower castes, again, you may find that there is some amount of, but of course there are problems with that kind of a formulation as well. But there is a slightly greater degree of sexual autonomy and freedom that women may have. So among the Brahmins, then there is a great deal of, there's a deep concern with virginity and I can't hear what you're saying. Come here. Come up. I can't hear you. Yeah. I didn't. Yeah. Yeah. If it comes to another caste. Yeah. So that's what I said. So among, again, it would seem a bit sort of flippant, but basically, if there is greater freedom in sexuality, then there is greater freedom in terms of procreation as well, right? So for a different caste where there may be remarriage, there may be divorce, and all of this is possible, then does that answer your question? What is he asking? You can answer. So I'll come to that. So that basically one thing that I'm saying is that fertility and sexuality are tied to each other. The other thing that I'm saying is that it is not enough for you to be fertile. You have to be fertile in a pure way. So that's among the Brahmins, purity of sexuality is very important. Yeah, so that not only do you have to produce children, but that also sexuality has to be controlled to the extent that you're not giving it to the wrong person, right? At any point of time in your life, which is why virginity at marriage is significant, right? Because a non-virgin becomes the impure sexuality, and that impure sexuality within a Brahmin kinship setup is as good as barren. Or as bad as barren. Yeah. Maintain the purity of caste. Yeah. Polygyny is allowed. Polyandry is not allowed. Okay. Social? Yeah, it is. Yeah, of course. So the assertion of sexuality and a certain kind of sexuality is tied to caste hierarchies. Because among the Brahmins then, maintaining purity of caste is tied to maintaining purity of sexuality. Right? Yeah. Okay. So that the point then is that among the Brahmins then, the value of fertility is linked to female sexual purity. So that's why virginity is a value, and anything that jeopardizes this sexual purity is said to jeopardize the patriline. Now, this is the fundamental difference with the newer. That, you may do whatever you want to with your sexuality, that doesn't change the patriline. So that doesn't change your relationship to your social father and who the social father is and so on. Whereas among the Brahmins, your sexual activity and your sexual world actually fundamentally affects the kinship system and the family. Okay. Can be polygyny, can marry. No, not allowed.
Then how does that carry on?
Confined to life of stigma. That's what I said, no? So life of stigma. So basically that, in this case, there is no flexibility. So there's, this hasn't happened. So the woman, and in most cases, as we all know, it's the woman's fault, right? So it's the woman who's confined to. Okay. So the next example that I will discuss is with reference to Punjabi kinship, and I'm drawing from a very, very interesting essay which I think I will circulate for reading, called Masks and Faces, Punjabi Kinship, which is by Veena Das. And can we have some silence? What she does is that she talks about how the character of Punjabi kinship is such that it engages the rules derived from nature as well as those derived from culture. Right? So again, we see the interplay of the biological facts of kinship and the social aspects of kinship. In Punjabi kinship, honor is a valued ideal, and this honor is something that is acquired and something that is enhanced, that you can actually enhance your honor by transcending certain natural forces rather than succumbing to them. So, for instance, it's honorable within the family to not talk to your husband all the time, right? So the husband comes into the house at the end of the work day, greets everybody, but does not greet the wife, right? So on the face of it, this is how you maintain honor. You don't, if your father-in-law is in the same room with your husband and you go to give something to the husband and the father-in-law, you don't sit yourself down along with your father-in-law and your husband, right? So there is a masking, and this is what she considers to be the mask. So there is a masking of real emotions and feelings that goes on for the play of the larger kinship system. Now, transcendence is a violation of human nature, and this too is represented as a mask which you wear in order to disguise certain pre-social or anti-social currents of the biological sphere. Now, again, another example of this that Das has given is of the child being raised in this family, which is a joint family setup, of course. That a mother's natural instinct is to run to the child when the child cries or to address the child's needs. In this family setup, you would actually mask that natural instinct. You would let the others do it before you do it, right? So interestingly, you don't run to the child. You hold on because you learn to de-individualize care of the child. That the care of the child is something that the whole family is responsible for. You are as much the mother as your sister-in-law, for instance, right? So through these kinds of sacrifices, what happens is that the individual is lifted from a lower plane to a higher social plane. And I think you can see this very, very significantly when we discuss the issue of the Khap Panchayat, that how is honor maintained in this context where you're actually transgressing some basic norms of the kinship system. Now, the belief is that the conduct that is derived from the biological sphere. So, in this case, what happens is that there are biological relations between, let's say, the son and the mother, and when the son gets married, there is a biological relationship which develops between the son and the wife because of the shared biological substance through the act of sex. But this certain aspects of the conduct that is derived from the biological sphere cannot be suppressed, but they need to be kept in what is called the backstage, right? So this aspect of the wife not sharing the same space as the husband, not eating with the husband, not talking, all of these are that you're actually keeping that shared biological link in the backstage, even though everybody is very aware of that shared biological link, and it's fundamental to the kinship system. Procreation and sexual union are the biological facts on which kinship morality is based. So if you look at the social sort of norms and rules surrounding family life and kinship, they're actually based on this fundamental fact. The man's role in procreation ends with the gift of conception, and it is, so the relationship between the father and the child is not as intimate as the relationship between the mother and the child. There are two biological facts that are significant, as I mentioned: the bonds of procreation, which is the mother and the son, and the bonds of sexual union, which are both, according to Das, within Punjabi kinship, both are biological facts. Now, both these create physical bonds between people. The difference being that one is replaceable and the other is not. So the bond with your mother is not replaceable, the bond with your wife is replaceable. So, and this shows in the kinds of relations, in the everydayness, the way you practice the everyday relations with both the mother and the son. So for instance, she has this example of, again she talks about how, there is that backstage where, you need to do certain things in order to keep alive this kind of notion of which is the primary relation. So in Punjabi kinship, then the primary relationship is between the mother and the son. And even though everybody is aware of that bond of sexual union, you need to keep that in the backstage. So she has this example of a newly married woman who has a fight with this husband's sister. And when the husband comes back and hears of the fight, he immediately takes the side of the sister and slaps the wife, right? But having done that, there is also what he does is that he, at night, he makes love to her in a not at all in a very indiscreet manner, so that everybody is aware that there is no estrangement between the husband and the wife, right? Now, this Veena Das uses this example to show how there is a conflict always within the family between the bond of procreation and the bond of sexual union. And the way in which partly this conflict is resolved is by playing out. So he really played a role, and he said that, okay, so I need to show that the bond of procreation is more significant, and that's what he showed by slapping the wife or taking the sister's side in a conflict between the wife and the sister. But at the same time, he also made them very aware that that this was not the case. So it's interesting that he says that the wife later on told the anthropologist Das that even though it was she who got the beating, it was the mother who looked like a gambler who had lost everything. So family life and the kinship system and the way in which it plays out, these kinship rules and the way in which they play out within the context of the family is full of such instances of what is supposed to be at the backstage and how people are performing their roles.
These norms are like actively encouraged, like the fact that if there's a conflict between the
So it's so the active.
learned, like that's how they're taught.
They're also because they're learned because also if you know, and this I think happens with many women where you're told are you going to behave like this when you go to your in-laws house, right? So the learned part is in the natal home, where you are taught how you are to behave in your marital home.
Like even when the man makes up with his wife at night, even that is something which is sort of going on, like the learning is passed on, or is it?
I think that if you look at any everyday practice, there is a point of learning that is being passed on, isn't it? So there is another example, for instance, where there is a conflict between two brothers. I mean, there is a conflict between the wife and the man's siblings, and in this case, the younger brother of the man, of the husband, hits the child. And so the wife complains and says, if he was your own child, you wouldn't have done that. And the mother-in-law immediately says that, you shouldn't have done that because, the child it belongs to all of us. It's the family's child in that sense. And in this case, the husband takes the side of the wife. And it leads to a full-blown conflict between the brothers and the mother, where the mother really says, we brought you up and you were in charge of taking care of all of us, and look how you're behaving now that your wife is here, and so on and so forth. But it ends up with them leaving the house finally, because things come to a head, and it ends up with them leaving the house and setting up a separate home. So I think that there are numerous ways in which families and individuals deal with some of these norms and regulations. So in that case of making love in an indiscreet manner to show this may not have been may have been unique, may not have been the regular way of doing it. Yeah, this is one example that she gives. Yeah. Now the other significant aspect is of the biradari, where the principle, basically that the principle of transcendence, of transcending the lower self, actually achieves significant force with regard to the biradari. So that whatever you're doing in the context of this larger extended kinship network. Right? So the biradari is actually called on, and this example that I just talked about, between where there is a conflict between the brothers, this conflict was played out in front of neighbors and relatives who came in. So everything then, a small private matter, which is that of the brother hitting the child, becomes a very large, in fact, a public issue where the biradari also joins in. So maintenance, with regard to the biradari then, maintenance of social appearance becomes most significant. Okay. Now, the next example that I have is of matrilineal descent. And as I said before, and once I finish matrilineal, I will give you a break, but I need you to not hum. Can we take a minute and stop the hum? Yeah. Okay, the minute only seems to exaggerate the hum. Okay, so so matrilineal kinship or matrilineal societies are also called uterine societies, and Nayars are an example of the matrilineal society, where both the biological and the social links are through women. And in the case of the Nayars, the matrilineal is defined both in terms of descent as well as residence. So it's descent is through the female line, but also residence is with the females, right? So that the woman does not move out of her natal home, and children don't move out of their natal home. Now, the father then in this system is merely a man who the mother is living with or has a relationship with, and so what happens is that you are not only are you genetically related to your mother, but you also have a strong social bond with your mother and her group, and it's possible that you overlook. And mother's brother, MB is mother's brother, right? So it's possible that you overlook completely the idea that the idea of having a relationship with your father. So in the Nayar matrilineal system, where descent is through the female line, where the father is an insignificant figure in the system of kinship, and where residence is matrilineal, matrilocal, in this case, you can actually go through life without having any connections with the father. So between the father and the child, often there is no bond whatsoever, and social position is handed down through the mother line. The male figure that is significant is the mother's brother. Now, we need to make a distinction when we think of matrilineal and matrilocal societies. It appears as though women are in positions of authority, and this is not the case. So we need to make a distinction between matrilineal and matriarchal societies. So a matriarchal society is where there is a male line of authority. In a matrilineal society, the line of authority may still be female. Female line of authority in matriarchal. So in this system, the mother's brother, even though married to somebody else, actually does not move out of the house, right? So it is the mother's brother who has more control over the children of in this case, the sister's children, at his own house. So husbands and wives don't stay with each other. Husbands don't move out of their houses. Wives don't move out of their houses. They continue to have relations with each other and maintain husband-wife relations with each other, but they remain they have separate residence. Huh? He will, but he has his sister to take care of. So in this system, the ties between the brother and the sister are strong, and the ties between the husband and the wife are weak. Right? No, everyone doesn't stay in the same house. The husband doesn't. The husband stays in his own house. His sister stays in that house where he stays. Yeah, he has to stay with his sister. The husband stays with his sister, does not move. So husband and wife, they don't move to a separate residence, nor does the wife move to where the husband is. Right? Okay. So So descent is through the female, and inheritance is through the female line, and yet we can't think of them as societies where authority and power lies with the females. Authority and power still lies with the men in the family. In this case, it's the brother, right, and not the husband. So, in some senses, in some of the studies, it has been articulated that is it better actually when the authority lies with somebody who you don't have a sexual union with? And Nair women tend to argue that it's not actually better, because sometimes the person you have a sexual union with, it is easier to actually manipulate and negotiate your position. Yes, you had a question? No. Okay. Because of this fact of the inheritance through the female line and the authority through the male line, often the matrilineal societies have been considered to be faced with what is called the matrilineal puzzle. That on the one hand, descent flows through the women and authority flows through the men, which is the brothers. But how does one, so how does one deal with this problem? One way of dealing with the problem is that of a twofold residence, where brothers and sisters remain together and they sacrifice living with their husbands. Now, as a result of this, what happens is that the tie between the husband and wife is actually very slender. So there's no real tie between husband and wife. But so you're married, you have a marriage, but you don't live together. You don't, your children don't take the name of the father, and so on. The children don't have relations, very strong relations with their father, and so on. The other way of resolving it is what is called the alternating marriage, where the husband and wife alternate annually in their respective kinship groups. So one is dual local residence, and the other may be this alternating marriage, where they move from one person's. So annually they. Barely any relationship. So the relationship of whether it's companionship, love, authority is shared with the mother's brother. The father visits the child. So, when we come to the marriage, we are going to discuss this in greater detail. So, the Nair woman can actually, there are two kinds of marriages. So, there's the tali tying ceremony, where, where in the prepubescent time, there is, you're married to an appropriate person of the same caste and so on. And after that, once the tali tying is done, you can actually have what are called sambandhans. So relationships, so visiting husbands is what is called. So you can have visiting husbands with anybody, provided they are of the same caste. Yeah. So you can, with multiple partners. So and in fact, when a woman is pregnant, all the men who she has been with give her gifts and so on in order to claim, claim fatherhood rights. Yeah, but it's not necessary, no? I mean, this is like, I don't know which Hindi film there was, but there was this film in which there's this woman heavily pregnant and somebody asks, ye kiska bacha hai? Right? I mean, obviously, the baby, you're seeing the belly full of baby, and like you're saying, kiska bacha hai? So this point is that, it's this, that the fact that we need to attribute a father is something that is typical to our context and our patriarchal and patrilineal society. Yeah. Yeah. How does the power relation of?
If a Nair woman is chosen by
as I think that one thing we have to understand that again, the case, when I'm discussing a case, to a certain extent, I'm discussing what I would call its ideal typical aspects, right? So one is not, and if you think of the Nayar's marriage and the Nayar kinship system, of course, it has undergone tremendous change. But in terms of, if you think of it in relation to what the in comparison to a patrilineal society, because of the inheritance passing through the female line, women had greater autonomy in relation to the patrilineal society. Within that context, of course, there are other factors which constrain and control their sexuality, their behavior. So, there was, they're forbidden from interactions with lower caste men, for instance. So all of that works, and that there are of course exploitative relations. So if you look at in the pre-colonial times, there are many liaisons with white people also. So there are clearly, the fact is that what we often tend to, when I present matrilineal in comparison to patrilineal society, there is a sense in which I present it as in some ways being liberating, right? Because it allows that kind of option for the women, which is not, of course, to say that it wasn't exploitative. That there were these, like what you mentioned, is a context for such exploitation, right? But to a large extent, and again, when you think of male authority, the male authority in this case is the mother's brother. So possibly in a scenario like that, it is the mother's brother who would have greater say in the relations that the woman will have, right? Rather than the husband, right? Okay, so this is again the representation, the genealogical chart for a matrilineal descent system. Okay, now so this is insofar as the first aspect of kinship is concerned, which is descent. The second aspect, and I will only take about 10 to 15 minutes, and then I'm going to give you a break, so please bear with me, is alliance. And one of the first people to sort of work on this is that, so there were two kinds, again, there's too much of a hum. Can I have silence, please? I know you're all anxious, but okay. So, you see, when you think of kinship, partly in some of the studies, what they were doing is that they were describing different kinds of kinship systems. Now, Levi-Strauss, who's a French structural anthropologist, what he does is he says that, instead of describing, what we need to do is we need to figure out the underlying logic that dictates these kinship systems, that dictates how people will behave in these systems. And so he tries to uncover this structural principle and the logic that underlines kinship decisions and practices. Well, he's written this whole book on structural anthropology. So if that's called failure, then I said. No, what he says is that, we can debate that. So what he says is that there are two aspects. One is the universal prohibition against marrying your own, which is the incest taboo, which then forces you to look for wives outside of your own society or your own system. So it is these two aspects that are at the crux of systems of kinship, according to Levi-Strauss. So what he's really focusing on is not descent, it's not how you are related to ancestors before you, but how you are related to people through your alliances. Now, what this means, what the incest taboo basically means, is that it creates two groups of people. People you can marry and people you cannot marry. Right? It also creates two other groups, which is the wife givers and the wife takers. Right? So there are people who, so when you start looking for wives outside your own group, then you create these two groups of wife givers and wife takers. So the incest taboo and the exchange of women are the two principles which are at the crux of the kinship system. And both these work, so you're committed to not marrying your own, and you're also committed to the idea of reciprocity. So when you think of exchange, one of the fundamental aspects that will drive exchange is reciprocity, which means that if you get a woman, so you have a man who wants to get married, you get a woman from outside the group. If you get a woman, it also means that you have to give a woman, right? Now, don't think of it simply in terms of like, what if I have no woman in the family? Then of course you can't give. But it's in terms of a principle that exchange is possible when there are two groups which are willing to share their women. Now, there are two forms of exchange. One could be a direct exchange, where I give a woman to group A and group B, and group B gives a woman back to group A, right? The other is a sort of more complex form of exchange, which operates on the principle of trust. And I think that this is also true for all kinds of relationships that we are in, which is that you give something with the hope of getting it back at some point. So A gives to B, B gives to C, C gives to D, and this can continue with the hope that at some point this circle is going to be completed and, X will get back from somewhere, right? So these are the two kinds of principles that on which this system of kinship based on alliance does work. Yeah. So then on the basis of this, there are two types of exchange of women, restricted and generalized. When I said direct, that is restricted, and generalized is when you have a more complex system. And when you are restricted, you can think of smaller groups. So two groups which are exchanging amongst themselves. And generalized, then you can start thinking of more complex situations where there are three or more groups exchanging women. Now this gives rise to the situation where you've created two groups of wife givers and wife takers. And I will end. No, don't clap.